Sego, and welcome to Let's Talk. I'm John Kane here with Shawnee Rice. Well, let's get us on screen here. We are on Facebook Live, so I want to make sure that everybody sees that we're really here. You're not just looking at a screen. All right. Again, John Kane, Shawnee Rice here. We are in the middle of a fund drive, so let me start off by saying, if you listen to the show, and if you listen to this show today, and you like what you hear, then I encourage you to go to the pledge line, and that number is 516-620-3602. Make a contribution to WBAI of any size. Look, if you do it online, or if you sign up to be a BAI buddy, give this show a mention. Let them know that you're donating on behalf of Let's Talk with John Kane, and it'll let management know how much you appreciate this show and what we're doing here. So. Again, the number is 516-620-3602. That's the number to call to make a pledge of any size. You can do a one-time deal. You can become, like I said, a BAI buddy, be a sustaining member, make a contribution of $5 or $10 or $20 or $100 a month. And that'll be revenue that comes into the station that we can count on, and that we can know that it's there, so we can manage this station with consistent cash flow. So we'd appreciate that. You can also go online. You can go to give2, that's GIVE, the number 2, WBAI.org, and you can do this all online. You can also follow steps there. You can do it by text. You can do it, you can send a check by snail mail, however you want to do it. Make a contribution to WBAI. Do it in the name of the show, and I would greatly appreciate it. If you sign up as a buddy during the show, they're going to say, "Hey, we had buddies sign up during your show." So I'd appreciate that as well. Look, I've got a good show planned for today. I've got an old friend, and I don't mean she's old. I mean we've been friends for a long time. Joining us here. Pam Palmater is she's Mi'kmaq. First, let me make that clear. She lives on what I call the other side of the imaginary line. She's an author, a lawyer, a professor, and like me, an activist. It's the only place where we line up. We're both activists. She's a frequent political commentator. She appears on the Aboriginal People's Television Network, In Focus, CTV, CBC. She is an associate professor and academic director of the Center for Indigenous Governance at Ryerson University. And like I said, she's the author of a couple of books. I'll mention Beyond Blood, which is one of my... That's the book that I originally became aware of Pam Palmater over, and it's Beyond Blood: Rethinking Identity and Belonging. So let me welcome Pam Palmater to Let's Talk. Pam, thank you so much for joining me today here on the show.
Well, thanks for having me again, old but young friend.
Well, it's been a long time. When I finally reached out to you, and I said, I can't remember the last time you were on my show.
Yeah, it's been quite a while.
Well, I've been following your work, though. I mean, and I listen to your podcast. I mean, you're also obviously you're a blogger, you're a YouTuber, you're a podcaster. You do all of these things, and of course, you are no stranger to television, especially on the other side of that imaginary line. That's where I see a lot of your work. And I wanted to reach out to you for a while, and we've been talking about this for a couple of weeks, and just trying to make it work out. And I'm glad you joined me on my New York show in particular. It's great to have you.
No, it's awesome, and I'm glad that you keep up with this show and that you keep these issues in the media, because that's part of the problem, is keeping attention on all of these Native issues, because they're a flash in the pan when it comes to mainstream media, and you only get 2 minutes of information and then it's gone. But with a show like yours, you can dive into these really critical issues in a really detailed way, in a more informed way.
I want to introduce you to my co-host, Shawnee Rice. Shawnee, this is Pam Palmater, and I encourage you to follow some of her work. She's been doing some great stuff.
Absolutely.
And Shawnee's very active. She's a bit of an activist herself. She manages to plug herself into issues relating to gender issues, environmental issues, social justice issues. So she's an activist in her own right. So I got to give her props too.
Oh, thank you.
That's awesome.
Well, Pam, one of the things I wanted to talk to you about. I had Laura Coogee, who is a poet, and she travels with Jeff Doreen, who does songs, Beatles songs in Mohawk. So I don't know if are familiar with any of Jeff's work. But when having the opportunity to talk with Laura, who is very involved in missing and murdered Indigenous women's issues and Two-Spirit issues and that kind of thing, one of the things that and I'm not saying that I wrestled with it, but when I heard this commission that was done on missing and murdered Indigenous women came up with the determination and literally, charged Canada with genocide as it related to missing and murdered Indigenous women, I had to give that a little pause. And look, and by no means am I minimizing what the missing and murdered Indigenous women issue is, but understanding that genocide has in its goal the to eliminate a people, and as much as heinous as the crimes are against women and others, but against women in particular, Indigenous women, I wasn't sure if the designation of genocide was entirely justified. And so Laura set me straight, and I want you to set me even further straight, because I do know that in order to make that case, you've got to talk about not only the systemic nature of the problem, but the policy-driven nature of the problem. So I want you to have at it.
Yeah, so, that has been the issue since the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls released their final report and all of their recommendations. The instantaneous debate by, most journalists was whether or not genocide was suitable. And the problem with the debate was that the people who were having it didn't even refer to the legal definition of genocide. So genocide is actually a crime in international law, not just because of the UN Convention that makes it a crime, but also because of decades and decades of what's called customary international law that develops over time from court cases. And people think that the standard for genocide is the Holocaust, because whenever they've heard the word, if they've heard it at all, it's in relation to a place or a time where there was mass killings of millions of people, and people think of the Holocaust. They don't know that there's actually a law that says there's many ways that you can commit genocide, and it's not what you need is the intent to destroy in whole or just in part.
Well, that's true,
a particular racial group. So it's not that you have to eliminate all of them. And the other thing about it is people think it's only about killing the members of that group, but it's not. There's actually 5 different ways to commit genocide, and you only need to be guilty of one. So, of course, killing people, causing serious bodily or mental harm, creating the conditions of life that's calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, preventing births within a group, or the forced transfer of children from that group to another group. Any one of those things is legally genocide, not only by the convention, but by customary international law.
So that's what we're doing then right now.
Well,
if it's forcing the children, the United States, if it's forcing children away from their original group,
sure,
that would be genocide, right?
Yeah.
It is legally genocide, but the problem is that when Western democracies, it's a lot easier to look at other countries that they don't like, that are of different cultures or different eras, and say, oh, look, they're committing genocide. Right. But when you have to put the focus on you, and in Canada, we have what even Canada has said is a humanitarian crisis of the forced transfer of Native children into white families. And that's been going on, and it's getting worse and worse and worse, and it's leading to their deaths, and they go murdered and disappeared as these young girls and young boys.
Well, and this is an extension of, I don't want to say necessarily just an extension, but this is like the residential school policy continuing in terms of foster care and again, displacing children from their families. So the very practice that existed for over 100 years of residential schools in both the U.S. and Canada continue on both sides with this foster care and this stripping of children away from. The crazy part is, when you get into the situation where you're suggesting that a specific child is going to be better off in a home that's not a Native home, you're you're trying to look at the individual without looking at the effect that you have on a people. This is where the whole thing becomes this debate about genocide. Because if you're going to eliminate a culture and strip a culture away from a child by putting that child in a situation where they will have no cultural connection, and in that cultural connection, that connection is also with land as well, not just with language and people. So and I think people don't understand that the role that the governments have played, and this is again getting back to that issue about it being systemic, is when you have policies that on the face of it saying, well, this is what's good for the individual child, but it's terrible for the people, and it's not necessarily even good for the individual child either.
Well, and the thing about it is that many people misunderstand at least Canadian government policy to be benign, to be well-intentioned. But there is more than enough historical evidence to show what was their intention. And it was to, quote-unquote, get rid of the Indian problem. It was to clear the plains, ethnic cleansing. And when their own lawyers, their justice lawyers, said, what you're doing brings you very close to the crime of manslaughter, they're like, well, that's no reason to stop this policy because we just want, quote-unquote, the final solution.
Well, and you say quote-unquote, but the reason we know that that's the intention is because it is well documented. I mean, there have been politicians ranging from the current Prime Minister's father, going much farther back than that, and including some of the language from Justin Trudeau himself. I mean, some of the things that he says, if you put them in their proper context, you realize are still perpetuating the same genocidal policies.
And then how can you argue with a policy? So, I mean, we were just talking about the forced transfer of kids, which happen, residential schools and foster care, which the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada found to be genocide. But then there's also the preventing births in a group. In Canada, we have the situation, just like you did in the U.S., of forced and coerced sterilizations, not just in history, but are ongoing. We're in the middle of a class action suit for ongoing forced and coerced sterilization.
And the other thing about forced, some of these were done where the women didn't even know it.
Yes,
they were led to believe they were going in for some other treatment, and
because of totally lying, or because of like medical jargon not being.
Oh, they just never told them. I mean, again, once these children were in these residential schools, especially, they were completely wards of the institution, not of the state, of the institution. They could do anything they wanted to those children. They didn't need any permission from the parents or anything else. And so some of that stuff not only would actually continue through Indian Health Services on the U.S. side and whatever the agency is on the Canadian side, but it absolutely continues.
Yeah. And here's the really sick part about the modern forced and coerced sterilization is that people in today's day and age are being forced against their will to be sterilized and then coerced by social workers who take their children away and say your kids are going into foster care, and unless you get yourself sterilized, you're never going to see your kids again. So they're wrongly taken to begin with. Then they're forced to have a sterilization procedure in order to get their kids back, which again is without consent because it's undue duress. So then you've got two factors of genocide implicated there.
What is the context to how a social worker is prescribing a woman to become sterilized in order to get kids? Is that like court mandated? Is that policy there?
No, this is a problem, and it happens in a whole bunch of different ways depending on which province you're in. But generally what happens is social workers are way overstepping their bounds. So they're saying, you don't have enough food in your cupboard, you don't have enough beds for your kids, you're not providing a good life for them, so we're going to take your kids. And, oh, by the way, I'm going to go meet with your doctor and you and lay down the law and say if you have any more kids, which you're not, prepared to take care of, then we're not going to give you your kids back unless you be sterilized. And that's in conjunction with doctors. So you've got these social workers forcing women to do this on racist assumptions about what makes a good parent and what doesn't make a good parent. And we all know why Native women might be living in poverty because of the land theft, dispossession, failure.
Well, and I think that's the main issue, is to understand that the poverty in the first place is policy driven. And it doesn't take much of a history lesson to explain how Native people end up in a situation where they're living in such abject poverty, especially when they're living within their Native communities, but not only there, even whether it's even in the urban areas.
So I just wanted to also clarify, because this is just news to me, but is this levels of like economics? So like this idea of being forced to be sterilized could happen to like poor white women, or is it specifically for Indigenous people?
We haven't heard of any situations where this is happening to poor white women in modern days. We know that it used to happen to women with mental health issues or who were institutionalized like a long time ago.
Okay.
But today the number one reason why kids are being taken is allegedly for conditions of poverty. Then they're being forced or coerced to have sterilizations. But, you can't forget about the fact that actually creating these impoverished conditions is, again, a factor of genocide. And our Canadian Human Rights Tribunal has already found that the number one reason why Native kids go into foster care is because of poverty and discriminatory race-based underfunding of social programs and services. So they get far less than what Canadians get in terms of health education.
Let me touch on something that you kind of went past when you're talking about non-Native people. When you talk about people who are mentally disabled, you have to understand that both on the U.S. and the Canadian side, being Native was considered a mental disability.
Yeah. Well, we had that in our Indian Act as well.
In both the U.S. and Canada, and that's why they they literally would label Native children in particular, but because they were the ones they could claim, take possession of, that they were, that they were mentally handicapped because just by virtue of being Native.
Here in Canada, under the Indian Act, they were called mentally incompetent Indians.
Sure. Yep. There you go. Well, and of course, they use that mental incompetency for any number of things. I mean, when it came to taking, I had the author of Killers of the Flower Moon on my show when David Graham first put the book out, and that's about the Osage murders, and that's where all of these wealthy Osage who had oil revenue were all forced to have a white guardian approve all of their expenditures because they were considered mentally incompetent to manage their own affairs. So, well, one of the things, we talked about those conditions that are created, but one of the things that I think is clear when it comes to specifically to missing and murdered Indigenous women is that you not only have a level of incompetence and an absence of any prioritization associated with missing and murdered Indigenous women by police, policing agencies, the government in general, and worse, you have a significant number of police authorities or agencies that are involved in the actual victimization of women.
Exactly. And so that was my research. So I had legal standing before the National Inquiry, which meant we could do like oral and written submissions, and each one of us had our own particular focus, and mine was on police as perpetrators. So police officers involved in the violent rapes, murders, and disappearances of Indigenous women and girls, police officers who are involved in the child porn rings, human trafficking, forced prostitution, and the regular kind of physical abuse in police custody, deaths in police custody.
We can't leave men and boys out of the mix either. Although much of our concentration is on women and girls,
Two-Spirit.
And Two-Spirit as well, because it covers all of it. I think there's probably a little question that that there's probably a higher number of women who are victimized because of the male dominant culture in general, and of course the sexualization of women, the Native women, and that kind of stuff. But when I think about what do they call those things where the cops grab somebody and they take them way off into the what do they call them? Starlight tours or
Starlight tours, yeah.
And this is for those of you who might be listening to the show and never heard of this. This is where police officers will grab a man or a woman, and then take them miles away. And keep in mind, this is on the Canadian side where the climate's a bit cooler, especially at night. And they would take these people and threaten to drop them off, or indeed drop them off miles away from any population. And if they died, then they were just another missing and murdered.
They were often
Indigenous
assaulted. Ahead of time, their clothes would be taken, their boots would be taken. I mean, here we can have like minus 40 degrees Celsius weather. So you're doing it knowing that they'll die. The difference between what police do in Starlight Tours with Indigenous men versus Indigenous women is for Indigenous women, they commit acts of sexualized violence. So they rape, abuse, and torture them, and then drop them off on the outskirts of town. So that's why this national inquiry focused very much on women, because there is a unique phenomena of male violence against women in general, but specifically state officials engaged in sexualized violence against Native women.
Well, so you've had two commissions. You had one on the residential schools, and that came up with the determination of genocide. Although I will say, I was really disappointed that when Murray Sinclair issued his ruling, that he felt the need to put a precursor in front of the word genocide and refer to it as cultural genocide, as if that's really a thing. I mean,
actually, the first page of the Truth and Reconciliation report says not only was it cultural genocide, but in all of its dealings with Indigenous peoples, it was cultural, physical, and biological genocide.
Well, unfortunately,
so we actually use those three.
Unfortunately, every time Murray Sinclair talked about it, he always, and it almost seemed like like this was some sort of just a cultural issue and not a physical issue, and as if stripping culture doesn't have a physical bearing as
and
well.
Mental harm, exactly. That causes mental harm, which is a category of genocide. So, I mean, and the thing is, I mean, you're raising a good point, because the TRC made this finding of genocide. It got like no attention at all. And it wasn't until the National Inquiry issued genocide, and it was by these Indigenous women commissioners primarily, and everyone just, they don't know what they're talking about, it can't be genocide, and my point was, wait a second, what are you so shocked about? We already have a TRC, a public commission that found genocide. Why the shock and outrage now, except for the fact that it's about Indigenous women and girls?
I think that's also why the word culture in front of it makes it it's like so intentional, is because if you say flat out genocide, it's more in your face, and it's more harder to ignore. But when you're saying cultural, it's like, okay, well, you're still here, so are you?
Well, we just we took your arts and crafts away, or
Indians
something like
just
that.
complaining about your culture yet again, sort of thing. So it paints a different narrative. And
that's what this national inquiry didn't do. Like when we made our submissions, I said, you need to make this finding. Don't put any adjectives on it.
Don't sugarcoat it, right?
Yeah, it's genocide, and it doesn't matter if you find Canada guilty of one of the 5 things or all 5 things. I mean, my submission was they're guilty of all 5. And the other thing I think it's important for your listeners to know is, it's not just the act of committing genocide or the conspiracy to do it or trying to incite other people to do it. It's also complicity in genocide. So when the Canadian state sits back and allows its police officers to rape and torture and beat and murder Indigenous women and girls and participate in human trafficking and child porn rings, that's complicity.
And actually, complicity under the international definition of genocide is genocide.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, it's still the crime. Right. It's still the crime of genocide. And so people really think it's about intent, it's about killing, but it's about all of these things, or any one of them, to be on the hook.
Well, and again, one of the things that concerns me is that, as you said earlier at the beginning of our conversation here, if you only think of genocide in terms of murder, massacres, or the Jewish Holocaust or something like that, if you don't consider the fact that there are people who are struggling to survive because of policy, because of behavior, because of racism, because of all of these things, then and when governments do little or nothing, or worse, are complicit or actively involved in it, and that's what we see. I mean, I just think. I think that there has to be some ownership to this, and even with these now the 2 reports, there seems to be a level of denial and rejection that continues. And of course, that's just on the Canadians. The United States hasn't even begun to own. I mean, you mentioned the word reparations when it comes to slavery, and people start to lose their mind. Of course, forgetting that Native people were enslaved as well, by the way.
Yeah, well, exactly, and everything that was done to Native people. And,
Right.
and the other thing is that, I mean, they may be in denial mode now, but this is actually very serious, because the people that can be punished criminally for genocide are not just the so-called constitutionally responsible rulers, whatever that is defined in a country, but it could be any of the public officials, any of the ministers, or private individuals. So, anybody can be, a part of this, and, they're clearly denying it for liability reasons, but if Canada was the human rights defending country that it claims to be, it would stand up before the world and say, this is how you take responsibility for genocide. You don't deny it like all the other states perpetrators of genocide. Of course they deny it. You stand up, you take responsibility, and you let the chips fall where they may, which means you deal with the criminal aspect of it, the civil liability, the compensation, the reparations, and you just go ahead and do it. But until there's a country in this planet that's willing to stand up and say, we're going to take responsibility for it, and this is how you deal with genocide and make reparation, then it'll always just be state perpetrators of genocide living in denial and the genocide continuing.
Well, and I think that's the biggest issue, is that it's hard to talk about what to do about past, or these past activities when they continue every day, and that's the conversation we have here on the show and on my show back home all the time. Is, look, we're not talking about just about bad history. When we talk about the doctrine of Christian discovery, if we talk about what children have gone through and women have gone through in the past, we have to frame it within the modern era that we're living in, that much of this stuff continues.
Yeah.
When Canada votes against the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, along with the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, I mean, they took a position against allowing a minimum standard to be established, which really only let Native people be regarded as human beings, because they already had the Declaration on the Rights or Human Rights, and this was just to make a finer point, and added very, very little new to the idea, other than recognizing that that the states have an obligation to recognize that we have the right to maintain a level of distinction, even as a state is imposes its will all around us. And of course, that doesn't even get into native sovereignty and some of the issues that you and I have talked about in the past. And we have a lot more to talk about. Pam, now that we've cracked the ice again here, and I really want to have you come back. I want to have you talk about some of the other issues. Obviously your two books are both associated with identity, but we've got suicide issues. We've got I mentioned to you as we spoke earlier that there's this ongoing effort to force municipalization on Native territories, to turn all of our Native territories into small Canadian municipalities. And there's a certain level of complicity that elected or appointed, or however they're determined, tribal leaders play a role in this thing, and we need to talk about some of that going down the road as well.
Well, that's awesome. Let's plan for about 5-hour show next time.
There we go. Well, every once in a while we pull off, special events down here in New York, and we really should, maybe when we get close to when we're pushing for this Indigenous Peoples Day to replace Columbus Day. Maybe we'll do a special. We'll get a 2-hour special or something like that lined up for something like that. Yeah,
that'd be awesome.
Well, let's work on that. Pam, I want to thank you so much for joining us. Again, your two books are, one is Beyond Blood: Rethinking Indigenous Identity, and Indigenous Nationhood: Empowering Grassroots Citizens. You can find both those on your website, which is www.pampalmater, one word, and that's PAMPALMATER.com. Pam Palmater. That's Dr. Pam Palmater, I guess. I leave I leave all the titles off. You're just Pam to me, darn it.
Yeah, exactly. I'm just Pam to me too.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us here. It's been great having you, and I look forward to having you come back. And if you're ever in New York, And I know you travel sometimes. Next time you're down,
and I go to New York a couple times a year.
well, we're gonna have to get you in studio. We air this. We stream this video of this show on Facebook and everything. So right now it's just got Shawnee and I on it and your voice. So next time we'll have your face in there maybe.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much for having me.
Of course. It was so nice to hear from you.
All right, that's Pam Palmer. She is the professor of law at Ryerson University. She is an author of 2 books, which you can find at her website, which is www.pampalmer.com. She's on Facebook. She's everywhere. Look her up on Google her, and you'll find her podcasts. You'll find some of her appearances on a number of the news magazine shows on the Canadian side, and she is she's been at this work for quite some time, and she remains very active on all of the critical issues that Native people face. So again, my greatest thanks to Pam Palmer for joining us for the half hour. Look, we're at the bottom of the hour, so we'll go out with another Murray Porter song. We'll come back and we're going to take your calls. The number to call in is 212-209-2877, 212-209-2877. That's the number to call to be a part of the show. Talk about what you heard during the first half hour or anything else that comes to your mind, and we'll pick it up from there. This is John Kane with Shawnee Rice, and this is Let's Talk.
Talk to somebody, let them know. Talk to your friends, let your feelings show. Even if it feels like there's nobody, don't let go. Sometimes it feels like the walls are closing in. Sometimes it feels like you'll never fit in. You know, lots of people love you. Don't let go. Even if you think no one cares about you, please remember there's something you can do. Not by yourself, I know that much is true. Reach out your hand, there'll be someone there for you. Just reach out. Try to be brave, pretend there's nothing wrong, but you need a little help, child, to make you feel strong. You know, lots of people love you, so don't let go. Lots of people love you. Don't let go. Lots of people love you. Don't let go. Don't let go.
All right, thanks for coming back. This is John Kane with Shawnee Rice. We're doing Let's Talk here. We are going to take your call, so the number to call is 212-209-2877. But I have to remind people we are in fund drive mode. So if you enjoyed the first half hour of this program and previous programs, and you'd like to hear more, the best way to secure this show and to secure this station is to make a donation. So I ask you to go to our pledge line, 516-620-3602. That's 516-620-3602. Make a donation of any size. A one-time donation. You can become a sustaining donor by becoming a BAI buddy. And again, if you mention this show as you're making it, you don't have to just donate now while I'm on the air. You can donate anytime. But if you do make a donation this week, next week, even when we're not in Fund Drive, make a mention that you're donating on because you listen to this show, or this show is one of the reasons you are donating. If you become a WBAI buddy, you can do that and become a buddy in the name of this program, and that's Let's Talk with John Kane. So, look, I'm asking for you to support the program. I'm asking for you to support WBAI, and you do so by going to the pledge line. Again, it's 516-620-3602. You can go online, and you can go just to a regular WBAI page, which is www.wbai.org, and you can follow the tabs to donate. Or you can go to our donation page, which is www.give WBAI.org, and you can make a donation there. Look, you can even follow the steps to donate by text on your cell phone or your computer, however you want to do it. So just again, I'm asking you to support the stations. I'm asking you to support the program, and you can do so anytime, but certainly during our fund drive. And we are a listener-supported radio, and although we don't have a large staff here, there are certainly significant costs to delivering this, the broadcasting on the station, and we need your support to do it. So again, 516-620-3602. That's the number to call. All right, the number to dial into to talk about Pam Palmer's interview or any of the subject matter that we've talked about in the past. You can call in at 212-209-2877. That's the number to call, 212-209-2877. Shawnee, one of the things that I was mentioning it to Reggie before the show. I've talked a lot about race and racism, and of course I invariably get into this debate with people and say, well, I don't like it when black people are racist, and of course, or Native people. I've been called a racist, and I've got to clarify each time that if you are not a part of the dominant culture, if you aren't the ones in control, then you are not racist. Now, so a person of color cannot be racist in the United States, and I say that. Look, they can be racially biased. They can be hateful. They can be angry. They can be bitter. But I got to clarify something, because although I don't believe a person of color, and when I say racism is a white thing, it's because white people control the politicians. They control the political process. They control the systems of power, and that's why it is only a white person who could be a racist. However, and I've got to say this and explain it, but people of color can support racism because they buy into that superiority. And I guess to explain it, I see in all of the people, the populations of oppressed people, there are those who find comfort by teaming up with the dominant culture around them, and even when they don't necessarily take that side. I'll give you an example. Native territories. Most of the policies that the tribes take or Native governance takes is coming from the advice from white people. It's their lawyers, it's their lobbyists, it's their consultants. It's because we have bought into this notion on some level, and in some places at a high level, that white people are better. And that they've got to figure it out, that their systems are better than our systems. Then what do? We adopt their police systems on our territory. We mirror their child protection services. We mirror their courts. We do all those things. Well, even though we know those systems don't serve us very well or anybody else, we have a tendency to buy into those systems. And it's because we in almost a self-deprecating manner, look at ourselves as being somewhat inferior.
But also, yes, I'm not arguing that, but also simultaneously, it's also because it's easier to do.
Right.
Because fighting systems in a country that, has genocide, created genocide on who you are as a people, is exhausting. And mentally, it's like mental warfare as well, because, I mean, as you said, being Indigenous could be labeled as mentally ill. But
Yeah.
So your whole life trajectory would be fighting against creating systems that are made for you in a battle that seems to be constantly uphill. I'm not disagreeing with you. I do think that a lot of colonized groups do take on the identity of the people who colonize them and believe this notion that they're inferior because that's what they've been spoon-fed their whole life, their whole existence. But it's also like simultaneously with like, well, okay, if we fight our whole lives, then like there's no point also in it. It can feel like that. I'm obviously not saying that that's true, because, you know, I do fight, you do fight, many of us do fight all the time, but that's another aspect.
Well, I mean,
of it.
and one of the things that kind of drove this home a little bit for me was I'm reading some of the news coming out of like Oklahoma, for instance, where the governor is trying to do to the native gaming interests there the same that the governor in New York has been doing. In fact, the Governor Stitt from Oklahoma wants to squeeze the native casinos for even more revenue sharing than he's gotten away with in the past. In fact, what he wants is what Governor Cuomo has. He wants 25% of their slot revenue and doesn't want to have to give anything up for it. And so as I'm watching, as I'm reading some of this stuff, and I'm realizing what this governor's trying to go for, and realizing that there's a significant native population in Oklahoma who want to resist this guy, it begs the question: why isn't there more teaming up? Why aren't Native people working more closely together? And part of the reason is we don't have statesmen. We don't have our Native representatives meeting with other Native representatives. We have lawyers doing it. We have consultants. So the lawyers who represent the Seneca Nation are gonna, maybe give a call to the lawyers representing, the various Native gaming interests in Oklahoma. But that's not the same thing as us doing it. And the reason that we're not doing it, and let's face it, Native people were actually somewhat known, especially the Six Nations, known for their statesmanship and their diplomacy back, hundreds of years ago. But now we've given all that up to people who we think are professionals, who are better at it than we are. And so I guess that's where I just wonder at some point how complicit we are as oppressed people in advancing some of the very racism that we're fighting over, because we have already accepted some lower standing in the eyes of, in our own eyes, I guess. And so I guess that's part of my concern.
Well, back to the beginning part of what you were talking about racism and how you were technically defining, technically as in the actual definition of racism, and the notion that like people don't like it when Native or Black people are racist. And I think that there's an argument around semantics, sure, but I think also the intention of why somebody would not be okay with a Native person being racist or with a Black person being racist feels to me a bit like, oh, well, like, yeah, white people can be racist and we know that, but how dare you as a Native think any less of a white person or any other group? Like, that's like racism, and that anger is reserved for only white people. And it's a weird, like, convoluted sort of lens of it, but like it's okay when they're racist, like we know that, blah blah blah, we're not gonna think about that anymore. But if a Black person is racist or a Native person is racist, it's like, what? Well, how? It's not allowing them to be a complex human being.
And again, the definition of racism is that you believe you are genetically superior based on that race. The fact that was a foregone conclusion held by all of the imperial powers of Europe, including the United States.
Scientists and researchers.
Yeah, I mean, they had scientists try to back it up, even though, of course, it was junk science. Mm-hmm. But I mean, so today, when you say something like Teddy Roosevelt was a white supremacist and a racist, oh well, yeah, but you have to consider that. Now these tapes come out with Reagan and Nixon, and some of their racist exchange over the African countries not siding with the United States on a UN resolution, and it's like, Really, people are surprised that Ronald Reagan was racist?
No.
I mean, also, Trump, there's nothing that Trump isn't saying that's short of the racism that Reagan or Nixon said, but they're holding the same thing. It's just,
this is MAGA. This is Make America Great Again. This is going right back to because that was the standard. That was the standard. And of course, when people of color oppose those kinds of things, I mean, when we spoke out against it, we were, we were radical, we were revolutionary. I mean, that's the way we were regarded. We were problems. And so today,
angry and over the top and flamboyant and anything other than just like furious with the with all of the stuff that we've I've been trying not to swear that whole sentence.
There's a lot of F's in there.
Right. So trauma. Let's just say all the trauma that we've endured and the genocide that we've endured since colonizers came to this country. The expectation that we're just supposed to be quiet and submissive about it, and if we're not, then we're all of those stereotypes and tropes that you get of a person of color.
And again, and I've got to say this, and whether I agree that every person of color should harbor ill will or animosity or anger towards every white person. No, I'm not suggesting that. But if there is a certain harboring of resentment because of centuries of racism, centuries of abuse and oppression, and of course, again, not just physical abuse, but the psychological abuse of always being told that you are somehow less, that you are inferior, that you are not quite human.
And it's not always blatant ways. It's subtle ways, and it's microcosms, it's institutionalized ways that, like, I mean, maybe white people are getting annoyed by hearing this and thinking that, well, like, I never told you were less than. But it's also like, like Native women getting paid to the dollar versus white women, something like that, walking down the street, getting shot or not getting shot, getting pulled over. Like, all of those things are reinforcing that you are other and you are
well,
not
it's funny because
normal.
I just heard a report this last week that talked about there being a debate on whether police shootings could really be tied to racism, because the note was that black officers were just as responsible for killing black suspects as white officers, and it's like, how many years have they been redoing that what I call the doll test, or what's called the doll test, over and over again, where clearly people are already being conditioned by the time they're 4 years old to already view people of color, even if you are a person of color. The doll test, and in case people don't know, is that test where they took children only about 4 or 5 years old, and they would interview them with dolls, and they'd ask the little white girl, which is the pretty doll, and they would pick the white doll.
Or good or bad.
What is the good doll?
Yeah.
And of course, the answers they got were predictable. Where it got thrown off was when they asked a black child the same thing, male or female, which is the good doll? And the white doll was the good doll. Which is the bad doll? Which is the ugly doll? And even when they asked the child, well, which doll looks more like you? Even after a child says the ugly doll is the black doll, when you ask that child which doll looks more like you, they would say the black doll. So,
and even this aside, if we're talking about police shooting people and whether it's somehow still a question of race or not, every mass shooter who is a white boy always comes out alive. Black kids, black boys who just exist, or black people who just exist, get shot for nothing.
Well, so I don't think the last white shooter didn't make it alive in Gilmore. He didn't.
Okay, but how many other thousands have there been?
But the other thing is that every one of those guys already are immediately assessed as having some sort of mental disorder.
But the police also somehow find this self-control and self-restraint within themselves suddenly to know how to operate to get the white killer out unharmed. How does that happen?
Well,
If
it's
not
also
race-based.
interesting because there may be a genuine fear that white people have of people of color, and that makes them more trigger happy. I mean, but that's still born
There's
out of racism.
absolutely
Is there a
no
caller?
question.
Okay, we only got one for the half hour, so we got to get out of here. So we'll go for it. Caller, you're up. You're the only caller for this this session. So have at it. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
Yes, my name is Eric from Brooklyn.
Hey, Eric.
We must understand the mentality of the Caucasian mindset. These are people who are limited on this planet, and they're scientists, and they're people of the higher ups. They know that they are limited as far as time is concerned. Therefore, their total destruction of the indigenous people and my people, me being a black man, and all the other people of so-called color, the Caucasian man has to kill them all because this is the only way of survival. He knows by nature he does not have any melanin in him whatsoever. Therefore, that limits his time.
Eric, I hate to cut you off short, but unfortunately you called in very close to the end. But you make a good point, and this is where that line between white supremacy, white privilege, and white fragility comes in. And I think the reason that you see the uptick in some of the racist language that you hear more now than ever is not born out of their real belief that they're superior, but that they're scared. I think white fragility is at play more here, and that's from Donald Trump all the way down to to the guy on the street. I think people are scared that they're not only because there may be a reckoning, but that their privilege is slipping away.
Well, it's slipping away from gender, and it's slipping away from race-based things as well. So,
hey, look, folks, I want to thank you guys for listening. I do encourage you to go to the fund, the pledge line and make a contribution. It's 516-620-3602. Make a donation of any size. Become a WBAI buddy, and do so in the name of Let's Talk. I'd greatly appreciate it. The station would appreciate it, and that's the way we afford to do what we do here. So I ask you again from the bottom of my heart that you dig deep and you make a contribution to WBAI, and do so in the name of the show. You can go to the website. You can go to give2wbai.org, or like I said, go to the pledge line 516-620-3602. I'm not sure if we'll be back next week, but we'll be back the following week. So, well, I will be. You're going on vacation.
I will be in Hawaii.
All right, so we'll be back in a couple of weeks. Hey, I got a parting shot. I got to wish my wife a happy birthday. It's her birthday this coming week. So happy birthday, Brenda. She's the one who shares the show to all these other group pages. So I wish I said it at the beginning of the show. Now I got to make her listen all the way to the end.
Happy birthday, Brenda.
All right. Thanks, folks. We'll see you in a couple of weeks. Yahweh.